Hello and welcome to the Comic Atlas. This is the first video in a series where we will look throughout the history of comic book characters. In this episode, we will check out the origin of Daredevil from the Silver Age of comics. Daredevil made his first appearance in the first issue of Daredevil, cover dated April of 1964. Although the story of how Matt Murdoch went from blind kid to yellow and later red costume vigilante has been retconned many times throughout the decades, most famously in the limited series The Man Without Fear and Daredevil Yellow. The core of the origin story still remains up to this day. The scene starts outside Foxwell's gym, where we found a number of shady characters speaking and referring to his boss called the Fixer. At this point, a bright yellow costumed man appears and is ridiculed, at which time he starts to make quick work of the other men at the gym. After giving them a break, we learn that said vigilante calls himself Daredevil. We go back to a flashback of battling Matt Murdoch, an over-the-hill prizefighter, speaking to his son Matthew. He tells him how he doesn't want his son to become an uneducated pug like himself and sends him back on his way to study. We watch as Matthew struggles with other kids of his age. While he excels at school, he is teased by other kids because he prefers studying than hanging out around them. In fact, it is at this time that he gets called Daredevil by one of his peers. As a way of letting out his anger, Matt starts to train his body and reaches his peak physical shape, while keeping up his good work at school and making his dad proud. While it all seems to be going alright, battling Matt Murdoch is really struggling. He is incapable of landing matches for himself, as he is seen as past his prime and never being a standout even when he was. It's at this point that he takes the fateful decision of contracting the Fixer as his new manager. It's revealed that Jack had rejected the services of the Fixer 10 years ago because he thought he was a shady manager, but with no other option he signs with him. Later that day, the life of young Matt Murdoch will change forever. While walking down through the street, Matt catches a glimpse of a blind man that is about to get hit by a truck. Heroically, Matt pushes the blind man out of the way, getting hit by the truck instead. But this was not a normal truck. During the crash, a cylinder containing radioactive material fell from the truck, hitting Matthew in the eyes and leaving him blind. Sometime later, we check on Matt and see that the loss of his sight hasn't soured his life. He goes to State College to study law and he shares his room with his new buddy, Franklin Foggy Nelson. We learn that the remaining senses in Matt have been enhanced to superhuman levels, and he developed a built-in radar sense that allows him to perceive the world almost better than a seeing man. We go back to Matt Murdoch, whose boxing career seems to be on the ups, but it's all been a setup by the Fixer. In his next fight, Murdoch is to take a dive in front of a packed crowd in New York. But be it because of his pride, or because Matthew being on the audience, Jack goes off the script and ends up winning the fight. Of course, the Fixer doesn't like the result, and he sends his trusted man Slade to kill Matt Murdoch. In the following scenes, we fast forward Matt's grief, his graduation as the valedictorian of his class, and the opening of his new law firm, Nelson and Murdoch, alongside Foggy. We also meet Secretary Karen Page, and the first seeds of Matt's attraction toward her are planted. Minutes later, Matt speaks on how he will bring justice to his father's murderers. We see him sewing his brand new yellow superhero costume and fixing his belly club to become a trusty weapon. Emboldened by the new breed of superheroes that roam the streets of New York and by his own superhuman abilities, Matt Murdoch takes the streets to find the Fixer. As we return to the present day, Daredevil comes to the presence of the Fixer and continues to wipe the floor with his underlings, as Foggy and Karen wonder the whereabouts of the blind attorney. While the fight continues, Matt loses track of both the Fixer and Slade, but he uses his sense of smell to track them down to the subway. In one last showdown, Daredevil uses his billy club to take care of Slade, but the Fixer is not so lucky, suffering a heart attack while being chased off by the hero. The story ends with Matt giving Slade to the police and returning to Karen and Foggy as he prays that justice has been done to the memory of his father. This is a classic story for a classic character. While we see the not so subtle idea of blind justice portrayed by Matthew, the execution of the story is great. While I'll admit that I'm not the biggest fan of comics in the Silver Age, mainly due to the amount of dialogue and text on every issue, in this case it is worth it. While not as dark as other future stories, it has Daredevil in its best element, fighting the mob bosses and corruption that plague the streets of New York City. Daredevil is one of those characters whose power lever just lends itself to these classes of stories. Anyway guys, that's all for today. Remember that this is only the first episode of a series in which I plan to cover the whole publication story of Daredevil. You can help by leaving your like and subscribe below and checking out my first video on the series for Spider-Man. Remember, this is the Comic Atlas and I wish you all a nice existence.